Hey guys, it's Megan, and today I want to talk about the book I read in December, which was The Federal Art Project and the Creation of Middlebrow Culture by Victoria Grieve. So before we get started, yes, I only read one book in December. I only finished one book in December. It was a busy month. I did 2 retail shows, I had jury duty, I renoed a bedroom, and I had family that stayed with me over the holiday for longer than a week. So not a lot of reading got done. And I thought about just lumping this book in with my January reads, but we're 10 days into January and I've already finished 2 books. So I feel like I'm gonna have a lot to cover in January. And honestly, I wanna just spend a minute talking about this book on its own and some of the ideas in it. So one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot lately, ever since I read Glenn Adamson's book, Fewer Better Things, which I read back in the fall, is this idea of the economics of art and the economics of craft, and basically how do we as artists get paid for our work. And I made a whole separate video about something in this book that set that off, where he was basically talking about how art or craft and handmade in particular are elitist because they're labor intensive. And then he just sort of transitions into this weird discussion of the gift economy. I won't rehash all of that. You can go back and find that video. I'll link it below this one. But suffice to say, ever since I read that, I've really been thinking about the economics of art and how artists get paid and what are the best ways for artists to get paid. So obviously, as a coach, as a teacher, I'm always trying to help artists make money. And typically the way I do that is helping artists sell more of their art or their craft or their products or their courses or whatever it is. And that's because that's the society we live in, right? We live in this capitalist society where most stuff is bought and sold on the free market. And so that's the best way that I can help artists and makers. But I also want to spend some of my time now envisioning other scenarios, basically future thinking about what other things could look like. And so in order to do that, in order to future think, it's important for me to research other types of basically art funding models. And the one that kept coming up for me that I kept thinking about was the Federal Arts Project, which was the project that took place. It went by a couple different names depending on who funded it, but it was a project that took place in the US during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, as part of the New Deal. And so I was a little bit familiar with what happened in that program, mostly because of this book, Ninth Street Women by Mary Gabriel. So first of all, this book is a beast, but I highly recommend it. The audiobook is fantastic. I never got through this. I was like, I gotta listen. It's a lot, but it's a beast, but it's wonderful. I read this a while back. But what's really interesting is that a lot of the artists that went on to quote unquote invent abstract expressionism were employed by the Federal Arts Program in the 1930s. And that really kind of kickstarted their creativity and kind of gave them some freedom and space to experiment. And so what I also think is interesting when we think about the New Deal and particularly the Works Progress Administration, which was who funded a lot of that, we tend to think of big public works, right? We think of the Hoover Dam, we think of big building projects, the lodge at Mount Hood, Oregon. We think of all these big projects, right? The National Park Service, all of these things. We think of these big projects. And I think when we think of art, we tend to think of the same thing. We think of the mural projects that came out. But what's really interesting, and they mention this in Ninth Street Women, and then they talk about it more in this book, is that artists were also just paid to create regular art. There was something called the easel division, where literally artists were just paid to make paintings. And that was a big part of the funding. There were other projects as well, regional projects, things that promoted culture. And so I kind of know a little bit about it, but I wanted to dive in more. And the unfortunate part is that I'm really interested in the economic side, and a lot of the books and a lot of the research really focus on the art that was created, the environment, all of these sort of things. So I'm sort of piecing together the economics through reading about it in other ways. But what really kind of struck me about this book is the way it argues for the Federal Arts Project as a way to create new consumers for art. And so that was the first interesting thing to me, is when I think about the New Deal, I think about, and particularly the New Deal in relationship to art, I think about it as oh, this is great. The government is funding more art. But the government was funding more art not because the government intended to fund art forever, as she argues in this book. They did it to basically build a consumer class for the arts, and specifically a middle-class consumer, a middle-class consumer for the arts. So not the high-end patron. They wanted the kind of average, everyday, middle-class consumer to fall in love with art. And they thought if the middle-class consumer fell in love with art, then they would end up buying more art, and eventually the artists who were employed by the federal arts program could be essentially weaned off, right? They would create the audience would, as the economy picked up, the audience would start to buy stuff, and then they would get weaned off the federal government's assistance. So that was like the big idea of the program. Did that really work? I don't know. We're going to talk about that in a second. So what she argues in this book, which I thought was pretty interesting, is that a lot of the ideas that shaped the different divisions and the different programs in the Federal Arts Project were influenced by the writings of John Dewey. So his most famous book in relationship to art is Art as Experience. I will be honest, I have been carrying this copy around with me since undergrad, so for like 20 years, and I've never actually read it. The idea behind it is fascinating to me. In a lot of ways, I consider Dewey's ideas and my ideas kindred spirits. He basically writes about like the value of living with art and the importance of art. And the reason I never read it is just because I really cannot get into his writing style. It's just like a little too obtuse for me. But it's funny because, you know, knowing what he's done and then reading this book where she talks a lot about Dewey's ideas, it's funny how much of them come up in my own book that I wrote last year, Permission to be an Artist, where I was really looking at like the role of art in the home and the role of art in everyday life. And that's what Dewey writes about a lot, about the role of art in everyday life, the role of art in education, and how important that is. And so a lot of Dewey's ideas influenced what happened in the Federal Arts Project. And so they approached this project with the goal of creating this middle-class consumer for art. And I think that in some ways this was like a little bit disappointing for me to learn, because in the grand scheme of my project of like looking at how do artists get paid, basically like the goal wasn't to change the way that artists get paid. It was just to try to create more of an audience for art so that they could sell more work. And on one hand, that's a noble goal, right? That's a goal of mine. I want to grow the audience for art. I want to grow the audience for craft. I want more people to buy our work. But it was a little bit disappointing to find out that in the end, this wasn't really about like an alternate economic model for art. It was just about spurring the economic model for art that we've had for the last, 300-400 years, basically, since like private patronage became the way that art was funded over, say, like religion or state, emperors, princes, kings, etc. Right? So I was a little disappointed to see that. I think the other thing that's interesting to me as I read this, and I made a note to myself that I think is worth reading in the margins. So I made a note where basically they were talking about the goal of this project was to create this, what she calls middlebrow taste, right? So in the 20s, in the 30s, you had this idea of like fine art, and then you had what was considered lowbrow. So that was movies and comic strips and things like this. So all that kind of like, as I talk about in my book, all that kind of like elite art world bullshit. And so what Dewey argued and what she's arguing in this book and what happened in the Federal Arts Program is that they were like, hey, there's this stuff in the middle. There's craft, there's folk art, there's all of these things that are existing between this really high and this really low, what she calls middlebrow culture. And that's where we need to basically shape taste so that people aren't, and this is me quoting the book, this is not my opinion, I just want you to know that. Basically, how do we shape taste so that people who can't afford the high culture art aren't just sucked into this lowbrow art. There's a middlebrow art for them. And so a lot of what happens, what she talks about in the book and what happens in the program is this idea of shaping taste. And so as I was reading about this idea of shaping taste, I made a note to myself. And basically this idea that it's saying if you have lots and lots of consumers, that can sustain you as an artist, and it can. But the note I wrote to myself was that this necessitates a different kind of work, and it's work that is less labor so that you can sell more of that. And so, and again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. So in my program, Artists and Profit Makers, one of the things I teach a lot is about this idea of bread and butter line, and I do it in my own work, right? So a bread and butter line is basically work that you can reproduce that's a slightly lower price point. It's incredibly profitable. That's what people get wrong about a bread and butter line, is that it needs to be incredibly profitable to support other work. But the idea is that you create this more reproducible work that's accessible to more people, and then that can help support your other creative work. And so that's basically what this project was trying to do. And I think that there's something very valuable in doing that, but it also means that you're limited by that kind of work, right? By necessity, you end up making work that is less labor intensive. And I still think all of that work is art and all of that work is valuable. But what happens when you want to make work that is more labor intensive, that doesn't appeal to the average consumer, but maybe also doesn't fit into that elite art world gallery model? How does that work get paid for? And this book didn't really answer that question for me. And that's really honestly like the question, that's the fundamental question of Fewer, Better Things, right? Where he discusses this idea of fine craft, of handmade being elitist, is like, there is work that is labor intensive and there's nothing we can do about that. And how does that work get paid for? And so I think that's what is sort of missing from this book and why I keep looking for these economic discussions. And so what I also wrote in the margins was that I think whether it's a result of this program or other things that have happened, I think we've done a good job in our culture of like cultivating quote unquote taste, right? So, a good example of this is people go back and they look at Target's like Design for All campaign, right? There's definitely been, we'll call it an aestheticizing of American culture. You see it in, home decor shows. You see it in, think of like Flip or Flop. Like you see it in all these things where we're building a certain aesthetic level in our culture. And there's also like a whole bunch of other like bullshit about that, about how like basically when we try to promote certain aesthetics over other ones and what is good design, we end up being intentionally or not, racist or sexist or all these things. So there's a lot of issues with labeling art, design, craft, whatever, good or bad. So, but what we have done, I think, in the last, say, 100 years since the Federal Arts Project is we've done a good job, if you care about promoting taste, like we've done a good job of promoting taste, right? People like aesthetics and people are more drawn to aesthetics. And I think if we cut out what's good or bad taste, the fact that people are drawn to aesthetic experience, aesthetic pleasure, I do think that's a good thing. But what I think we haven't done in the last 100 years, and what I'm still looking for these solutions for, is we've done a good job of cultivating taste, but we haven't done a good job of cultivating appreciation and willingness to pay for the labor that creates this piece. And yes, you know me, like it all comes back to labor exploitation. But honestly, this is, I think, part of the problem and part of what I think this program missed, and what I am always looking for when I'm trying to look at like different economic models is how do we value and pay for work that is labor intensive? And how do we say, hey, yes, you're paying for design, you're paying for aesthetics, but also a human is creating that and a human is putting labor in. And we live in a culture that hugely undervalues labor. That's a whole other conversation, right? But I think that's really important to what we're talking about here is we don't value labor. That's why we see AI being rolled out. That's why we see self-checkout in stores. And by we, I mean capitalism, right? Capitalism is always looking to not pay for labor. And that's trickled down to us as the consumer, right? We assume that if something is overpriced, it's because the worker is getting paid too much, when in reality, it's the complete opposite, right? Like it's typically the worker is getting paid shit, the executives, the stockholders are making big bank, but capitalism has basically taught us to have disdain for labor and have disdain for workers. And so I think that the project, when I think about these economic models and I think about what did and didn't work in this project of the Federal Arts Project, in this project of trying to develop middlebrow culture, I think what didn't work was we didn't cultivate a value of labor. And so that's why a lot of artists and makers feel frustrated. There's a fantastic book that I read a number of years ago called Cheap by Ellen Ruppel-Shell that is really worth reading because it talks a lot about how like the race to the bottom in terms of consumer goods has negatively affected our culture. There's a lot about fast fashion that's worth really looking into. Basically, this devaluation of labor has led us to think that all stuff, including art, craft, stuff made by humans, it's led us to believe that all stuff should be cheap. And so I think when we're talking about economic models of art, and this is why I talk about labor exploitation so much, when we're talking about economic models of art and we're talking about building an audience for art, I think one of the big things that needs to happen, and one of the things that's really missing from this project, this Federal Arts Project in general, and this making of middlebrow culture, what's missing is this appreciation and valuation of labor. And so that's something I'm going to continue to talk about. It's something I'm going to continue to be interested in. You know, if anyone has any good research on the Federal Arts Project, on other alternate models, economic models for the arts, I am all ears. Please drop me a comment. And, you know, if you want to hear more about what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, please like and subscribe. This is not a topic I'm letting go of anytime soon. I've still got a lot to think about, a lot to read, a lot to learn, and I will be sharing it all with you guys. So have a great day, everybody.